On the 1st of July, 1946, they finally executed it. Not with a firing squad, not with electricity, but with heat so intense it turned metal into liquid. The technicians watched as the 14-pound sphere lost its shape, bleeding into a crucible, becoming something formless and running. They told themselves this was an ending, that the demon had been unmade. But plutonium does not die. It waits. What they melted that afternoon was not merely a component for a third bomb. It was a witness. It was evidence. A 6.2 kilogram accumulation of rage that had already tasted human life twice in 9 months. They called it subcritical, a mass that could not sustain its own fire, yet it burned Harry Daghlian and Louis Slotin from the inside out with equal appetite. Both died in the same hospital room, on the same calendar date, separated by exactly 36 weeks to the day. Both saw the same blue light, an unearthly flash that marked them not with radiation, but with selection. When they poured that molten metal into new molds, they weren't destroying the curse. They were baptizing it, redistributing it. The core became dozens of new cores, slipping into the American nuclear stockpile like a ghost possessing multiple bodies. You cannot kill what was never alive. You can only dilute its presence until it is everywhere, waiting in the silence of containment facilities, humming in the dark, ready for the next hand to touch it, the next screwdriver to slip, the next Tuesday, the 21st, to roll around on the calendar. It is still warm to the touch. It is always warm. It would have fit in your palm, this thing that was going to eclipse Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. 14 pounds of polished plutonium, plated in nickel to cage the poison leaking from its skin, yet still warm, disturbingly, biologically warm, like a small animal resting in its carrying case. They had named it Rufus, as if naming it domesticated it, and scheduled it for Tokyo in late August of 1945. But the Empire surrendered on the 15th, and Rufus became an orphan. Orphans are dangerous. When a weapon loses its purpose, it does not go quiet. It goes hunting. The physicists at Los Alamos kept the sphere in their pockets, literally carrying it between buildings and secure containers, feeling that gentle heat transfer through the metal walls. They told themselves it was inert, subcritical, meaning its very geometry forbade the chain reaction. The neutrons it spat out would escape into air rather than striking other atoms, breeding more neutrons, breeding fire. It was safe. It was docile. It was, in the words of the men who would die handling it, just warm enough to notice. But Richard Feynman, who saw probability waves and heard the rhythms of atoms, gave it a different name. He called these experiments tickling the tail of a sleeping dragon. Not slaying the dragon, not observing it from behind glass. Tickling. The specific intimacy of the verb is what haunts. The suggestion of a caress, a deliberate provocation of something that only appears to be dormant. The men laughed when he said it. They were physicists, soldiers of science, and they believed the dragon was a metaphor. It was not a metaphor. It was a warning dressed in poetry. When Japan's surrender left the core without a target, Otto Frisch claimed it for the critical assembly group. The military had no more use for the metal, but science did. They would use Rufus to find the exact point of no return, to measure how close a man could bring reflective materials to the sphere's surface before the neutrons stopped escaping and began colliding, multiplying, achieving criticality, not with explosives but with mere proximity. They wanted to stand on the precipice and measure the depth of the fall. They wanted to see the dragon's eyes open, trusting they could step back before the teeth closed. They forgot that dragons, once woken, remember the hands that disturbed them. Tuesday, August 21st, 1945. The desert was cooling into evening when Harry Daghlian Jr., 24 years old and alone, returned to the Omega site. He should not have been there. The protocol demanded pairs, but curiosity is a solitary addiction, and Harry wanted to know exactly where the edge was. He was stacking tungsten carbide bricks around the sphere, gray, dense blocks that would reflect neutrons back upon their source like mirrors returning a gaze. The counter clicked faster with each layer, a mechanical heartbeat accelerating, warning him that the dragon was stirring. The device told him he was near. Too near. He began to withdraw the final brick, fingers ginger on the heavy ceramic, and his grip betrayed him. The brick fell, not onto the floor, but directly onto the center of the assembly. In the fraction of a second it took to travel 6 inches, the air turned electric blue. Cherenkov radiation, they would call it in the textbooks, a pretty name for light that has no business existing in human spaces. It was accompanied not by sound but by heat, a sudden dry wave that pressed against Harry's face like an exhalation from something ancient and ravenous. Harry knocked the brick away with his right hand. The gesture saved the facility and cost him everything. In less than a second of exposure, he absorbed 400 rem, a dose calculated later with clinical precision, measured against the ticking of his own death. But death did not come quickly. It took 25 days to finish him, 25 days of his body liquefying from the inside while his skin held its shape, 25 days documented with scientific detachment, because Harry had donated himself to science, understanding that his corpse would be the textbook that warned others. 9 days after the flash, a photographer captured his right hand. The image shows something no longer entirely flesh, blistered, darkened, the fingers curling in a permanent accusation toward the camera. Harry lingered. 16 days more, falling into coma as his organs dissolved, cared for in his final hours by Private Robert Hemmerly, a security guard who had been sitting at a desk nearby that night, reading a newspaper, close enough to be brushed by the same invisible scythe. Hemmerly would survive another 33 years, long enough to father children and grow old, before leukemia, birthmarked by that distant Tuesday, finally claimed him too. Harry died on September 15th, the first American casualty of the atomic age. Not from a bomb dropped in war, but from a brick dropped in peace. "9 months is not long enough for a ghost to grow restless, but it is precisely the right interval for a pattern to reveal itself. On Tuesday, May 21st, 1946, another Tuesday, the 21st, though no calendar warned of the resonance, Louis Slotin stood before the same sphere, now moved to the Palo Alto laboratory but otherwise unchanged. Slotin was 35, Canadian, brilliant, and famously brash. Where Harry Daghlian had been cautious, Slotin was theatricality tests in blue jeans and cowboy boots, performing what he called tickling the dragon's tail, without the safety spacers designed to prevent catastrophe. He preferred a flathead screwdriver, a kitchen utensil essentially, to maintain the gap between two beryllium hemispheres that would, if closed, complete a sphere around the plutonium and reflect neutrons back into their source until the fire became self-sustaining. Enrico Fermi had watched him work and spoken a prophecy that sounded like a curse. "Keep doing that experiment that way, and you'll be dead within a year." Slotin laughed. He had performed the screwdriver trick dozens of times, lowering the upper hemisphere with his left hand while holding the gap open with the tool in his right, bringing the reflective surfaces close enough to taste criticality without swallowing it. He was the expert among experts. He was untouchable. That afternoon, 7 colleagues gathered to watch him work. The room was crowded with witnesses as Slotin began his demonstration. The final one before the core was scheduled for the Bikini Atoll tests. He lowered the beryllium dome. The screwdriver blade, slippery or simply tired, slid free. The hemispheres kissed with a sound no louder than a sigh, and the air screamed blue. It was prompt critical this time, faster than Harry's accident, instantaneous, the chain reaction achieving in microseconds what should have been impossible. Slotin felt the heat and the light, the same dragon's breath that had taken Harry, but he did not run. Instead, he tore the hemispheres apart with his bare hands, a gesture of such suicidal heroism it seemed almost absurd, flipping the upper shell onto the floor, exposing the core, stopping the reaction while the radiation continued to pour through his tissues. His first words, spoken to the 7 men frozen in the doorway, were a quiet resignation. "Well, that does it." Then he commanded them back. He handed them chalk, ordinary classroom chalk, and made them mark their positions on the floor, calculating in his head the geometry of their exposure, determining exactly how much life each had lost while he stood at ground zero. He had absorbed over 1,000 rads, possibly the highest dose any human being has ever received and survived long enough to measure. 9 days later, he died in the same hospital room where Harry Daghlian had passed, cared for by the same nurse, on another Tuesday the 21st, as if the demon core were keeping appointments with the calendar. 9 days versus 25. The dragon had learned to eat faster. There is a room at the U.S. Engineers Hospital at Los Alamos, where the light falls differently than in other rooms, or so the staff whispered. It is just a room, white walls, a bed, a window overlooking the desert. But between September 15, 1945, and May 30, 1946, it became a calendar. Harry Daghlian occupied it for 25 days, liquefying. Louis Slotin occupied it for 9, burning faster but with the same internal fire. Both men died on a Tuesday. Both died on the 21st day of the month. Both were tended by the same nurse, who must have experienced the terrible déjà vu of watching the same death arrive via 2 different faces, separated by exactly 36 weeks. The physicists called this coincidence. They had to. The alternative was to admit that the plutonium was not merely radioactive, but recursive, a poison that had learned to schedule its meals. But the calendar lies. It suggests that once the second Tuesday passed, the curse lifted. It did not. Private Robert Hemmerly, who sat reading his newspaper 10 feet from Harry on that August night, who felt only a breeze of blue light and thought himself lucky, died. 33 years later of acute myelogenous leukemia. 33 years. The latency period of a hex. Hemmerly had time to marry, to father 2 children, to grow gray, before the cells Harry had irradiated finally woke in his marrow and began to replicate their host's death. The demon core does not kill immediately. It merely bookmarks you. It enters your chromosomes like a library due date stamp, waiting for the right Tuesday, the right hospital room, the right set of coincidences to align before it collects. The room is still there. The desert light still falls through its window at odd angles, and somewhere in the nuclear stockpile, the metal that filled that room twice waits for the next appointment. On July 1st, 1946, they finally destroyed it. Technicians at Los Alamos watched the 14-pound sphere bleed into a crucible, losing its geometry, its polish, its name. They called it decommissioning. They should have called it mitosis. When plutonium melts, it does not die, it divides. The metal that killed Daghlian and Slotin was poured into molds and distributed across the growing American nuclear arsenal, becoming 20 new cores, 50 new triggers, 100 new opportunities for the blue light to flash. You cannot execute a demon. You can only scatter its ashes. Since that Tuesday in May, over 60 criticality accidents have been recorded in facilities from Serov to Los Alamos to Tokaimura. 21 deaths. The dragon has eaten in Russia, in Japan, in the secret cities where the same experiments continue under different flags. Each incident carries the same signature: the Cherenkov flash, the heat wave, the sudden understanding that the tail was never sleeping, only pretending. The screwdriver still slips. The beryllium hemispheres still close. The hands still reach out to steady falling bricks in the milliseconds before criticality, because human reflex has not evolved to fear radiation, only fire. It is everywhere now. The demon core was not destroyed on July 1st. It was baptized into transubstantiation, becoming the breath in every warhead, the warm pulse in every silo. The next accident will not involve a sphere named Rufus. It will involve a technician in 2026 or 2036, lowering a containment vessel, holding a tool too casually, tickling a tail that has been waiting since 1946 for the next hand brave enough or stupid enough to wake it. The calendar still has Tuesdays, the hospitals still have rooms, and the metal is still warm to the touch. It is always warm.